Human Rights Watch has released their annual report reviewing more than 90 countries and their practices over human rights. The group put the ongoing refugee crisis at the top of their list. The report blamed Western governments for curtailing human rights in efforts to protect their countries. HRW also highlighted more than 60 million people who have been displaced by war or repression globally.
Fear of terrorism, particularly prompted by the attacks in Paris, but also by the attacks in Beirut, the attacks here in Istanbul and Ankara and elsewhere, led many people to begin to scapegoat the refugees. It led to rising Islamophobia and trampling on basic rights, particularly to privacy, without any real showing of even effectiveness for those measures. And a very different kind of fear, fear on the part of many authoritarian governments around the world, many autocrats, fear about being held to account by their people, led to an unprecedented crackdown on civil society and the ability of people to band together and make their voices heard collectively.
Well, that was Kenneth Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, speaking during the launch of the report here in Istanbul, and he joins me now live from the venue. Mr. Roth, very good to speak to you this afternoon. Just take us through some of your concerns for human rights abuses around the globe.
Well, Human Rights Watch identified two global trends that were disturbing over the last year. One, as you just noted, is the response to the refugee crisis. As a million refugees made their way across the Mediterranean to Europe, we saw a real tendency to cut back on respect for the rights for these asylum seekers, as well as a number of counterterrorism measures that were of concern, the return to mass surveillance, the institution of a state of emergency in France and the like. Then when we look more globally, what we've seen is a number of autocratic governments around the world who are increasingly fearful of the ability of civil society to mobilize people, particularly using social media to put people on the street in protest against governmental misconduct. And so we've seen a real unprecedented effort on the part of those authoritarian governments to undermine civil society, particularly to deprive them of the right to seek funding abroad as an effort to stand above the people rather than to serve the people by hearing their needs.
And Mr. Roth, when you look at Western Europe and a number of draconian measures that have come in places like Denmark and proposals in places like France, how do you see the human rights of refugees who are trying to make it to safe refuge in those countries?
Well, we're quite concerned about a number of measures that the European Union seems to be taking. First of all, the erection of barriers to make it harder for asylum seekers to move around Europe. This latest effort by Denmark is just plain cruel. I mean, if they really wanted asylum seekers to help pay their way, let them get a job, let them build a normal life. They'll more than pay back whatever upfront costs Denmark spends. But rather, they're going after these impoverished, vulnerable refugees, taking away women's jewelry and taking their last few euros of money. I mean, that's just a cruel way to respond. We're also worried, frankly, about the pressure that the European Union is putting on Turkey to undermine the rights of refugees. The European Union is saying, we'll give you 3 billion euros, just stop the refugee flow. Now, there are good and bad ways to do that. If that's done voluntarily by enabling refugees in Turkey to find jobs, to educate their kids, to build a real future in Turkey while they wait for conditions to improve in Syria so they can return home, then that's for the good. That's a voluntary approach. But if Europe is saying, oh, really, Turkey, we want you to shut the borders, we want you to push back refugees, we want you to block the boats from leaving, that violates the rights of asylum seekers, and Turkey should flatly refuse to take part. They should not be bribed by the 3 billion euros.
And Mr. Roth, just finally then, where do you see us in terms of human rights? We've got conflicts across the globe, millions of people fleeing persecution and heading to Europe. We're at a bit of a nadir in terms of human rights globally.
Well, I mean, globally, if you look around the world, obviously the people are fleeing because they are facing severe persecution at home. Syria is an ideal example. I mean, a good half of the refugees arriving in Europe are fleeing Syria. And what are they fleeing? They're fleeing mainly the atrocities by the Assad government, his barrel bombing of civilians, his besieging of civilian population, his torture and execution of political prisoners. And that's why, as countries convene in Geneva to discuss political talks to try to resolve this horrible conflict, it's important to recognize that the opposition is not going to accept some kind of interim role for Assad, which they're being asked to do, until the U.S. enlists Russia and Iran, the countries with the most influence, to get Assad to stop these atrocities, to stop targeting civilians, to stop besieging civilians, and to release the many political prisoners who are held in his prisons.
Well, Kenneth Roth there from Human Rights Watch, we thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.